Yeah? Okay. Only a couple more slides here. Where is wine made? So there's only certain regions of the globe where we can produce grapes with sufficient quality to generate wonderful wines. Certain parts of the coast of North America, certain parts of South America, notably Chile and Argentina. I'll tell you that a favorite wine of mine is the Malbec, coming from Argentina frequently. Um, Happily, lots of Europe, right? And South Africa. We see lots of wines coming from South Africa, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So, relatively narrow regions where we have a moderate to wet climate. Something else that I want to mention, and your book, your text describes. Oop, phone's ringing. Excuse me. Now, where was I? Right. So regions where we make good wine all around the globe. Something that's made much of in your text and in one of the readings from molecular gastronomy I gave you was the idea of terroir, which is a French word that connotes the effect of the region where the grape is grown on the characteristics of the wine. And it makes sense that wine would be extremely variable, because what we're really talking about are the compounds that are generated within the grape by the plant during the development of that grape. Most importantly, of course, is going to be the sugars that are developed. But there's also other important characteristics as well. We talked about a few minutes ago the phenols and polyphenols that are generated by plants that affect the flavor of the and other characteristics of the food. So it makes sense then that that grape, the quality of that grape, and the qualities of that grape are going to depend on where the grape is grown, and that's obvious just from by looking at this map. But even within the, specific regions that are known for growing wine, the local effects are thought to be very, very important. Not only the local environment, but also changes in the local environment. When do the rains stop? How abruptly do they stop? So there are many variables that go into the production of wine, and this is part of the reason for considering the vintage of the wine. This is something else that your text makes mention of. What year was the wine produced, and what was the weather during that year? Not only where was the grape grown, but what was the weather during the year that those grapes were grown. And I just want to quote something from your text, or sorry, from the molecular gastronomy reading that I gave you. Some of his essays are a little obtuse, but let's see what we can gather from this. What makes the terroir? What makes a good terroir good for growing wine? The INRA agronomist showed that in Alsace, more than in the Bordeaux region of the Loire Valley, the principal differences result from variations in the maturity of the grapes at the moment of harvest. In all the wine growing regions studied, water nourishment conditions played a major role in determining, among other things, the length of time between the fruiting of the vine and the ripening of the grapes. Maturation comes late when water is plentiful, because the vine produces leaves rather than berries. When the supply of water is insufficient, maturation is delayed as well. But the adage that the vine must be made to suffer if it is to produce grapes is only partly true. The supply of water should decline both moderately and regularly. So it's complicated, and if you look closely at that essay, they don't draw any very good conclusions. It sounds like these French scientists have been studying terroir without discovering very much meaningful or easily explainable. But the bottom line is that there does seem to be some real effect on of the environment and changes in the environment on the characteristics of the wine and of the grape and of the wine. Therefore, okay. So what's in wine? Well, grapes are harvested when they have 20 to 30% sugar by weight. I mentioned already the presence of tartaric acid. Malic acid as well inhibits microbial growth by lowering the pH. Remember, I told you that Clostridium is a bacterium that's going to grow in anaerobic conditions at higher pH, and so we can inhibit the growth of most microorganisms except for those who are selected to live at acid pH by the inclusion of these small organic acids. Tannins, here again, are these phenols and these polyphenols. The tannins provide bitter, astringent notes to the wine. Tannins are found in the seeds of the grape, in the skins of the grape, and also in the wooden barrels. What is wooden barrels made from? Trees, also plants that produce polyphenols that are present in the wood. So all of these components of the, you have to consider the barrel as a component of the wine, and all of these components provide interesting, perhaps unpleasant characteristics to the wine. So here is epicatechin. This is a tannin, and usually we think of tannins as larger polymeric acids. They so here's when, let me back up and say, what's a phenol? Well, it's a phenyl ring. There's a phenyl ring, and it's got a hydroxyl. Okay, so that's a phenol, and this is a polyphenol, right? We've got a couple of rings, maybe a few rings. This one's not aromatic, but there it is, a few rings with some hydroxyls hanging off them. And when these tannins polymerize, which is something that happens over the lifetime of the wine, the astringency is found to decrease. So actually, we can mature a wine by polymerizing these phenols into polymers, and this makes the wine a little bit more palatable. The pigments of white and red wines are derived from tannins and other phenols. So I'm going to talk more about wine color in just a moment. We'll talk about wine varieties in the next lecture, but just to give you the sense, this is the species of grape, Vitis vinifera. The cultivars, that is, you can consider these to be subspecies, exist in the thousands, and so far more than we can go into in any great detail. I mentioned one that I like, Malbec, that's grown frequently in Argentina. And here's just a picture of those grapes. So we'll try to get a sense of the variety of wines, of grapes and wines next time, but just so you know, it's kind of overwhelming. So let's talk more about wine color. I talked about the tannins. You can see that this molecule, which is which is also known as an anthocyanin, is also a flavonoid. So the tannins are also flavonoids. Anthocyanin is a common flavonoid that gives plants of many varieties blue, purple, and red pigments. Let's see, frequently glycosylated, attached to a sugar. pH sensitive. Now, we don't really need to go into the details of that pH sensitivity and what's being protonated or deprotonated at different pHs, but we see that we're carrying a charge here in this structure, and you can imagine that if you alter the charge state of this molecule, you're going to alter the color, and that's in fact what we see. If we suspend our anthocyanin in solutions of different colors, we see that we really span a wide range of color, typically purples and purple to reddish, but at extremely high pH, basic pH, we see that we are even bright yellows. Anyway, very interesting to see here where the varied characteristics of the wine come from. One variable is the pH, and that has effect on, among other things, the anthocyanins that are in that wine. Now, as I said, polyphenols polymerize, and as with the tannins, which polymerize and make them for a mellower tasting wine or less astringent wine, so too the anthocyanins can polymerize, and just as changing the pH or charge state of that molecule affects the color, so too the polymeric state changes, and we go to sort of darker purples or even brownish colors, so we can alter the palette of the wine based on the polymerization of our anthocyanins. I mentioned the use of sulfur as a preservative, getting us back to the quality of the preserved wines to where. Okay, so where were we? I mentioned that there was a noticeable degradation in the quality of wine after the introduction of the wooden barrel. This is something that your text describes very in great detail. And that quality was recaptured with the introduction of sulfur to the wine. And this is a sulfur. This has a couple of different effects, but the principal effect in terms of quality is the, again, inhibition of microbial growth, the growth of other anaerobes that are going to contaminate and make the wine sour, perhaps. So the story is that in the 17th century, brimstone candles infused with sulfur were placed in the bottom of the wine casks before the wine was added and burned, and this sort of coats the interior with sulfur that acted to inhibit microbial growth. So this while it sounds like this kind of modern and antiseptic method, has actually been around for hundreds of years. Now, however, we add sulfur dioxide directly to the wine instead of burning brimstone candles. Interestingly, white wine is particularly high in sulfur dioxide, and that has a number that the principal reason for that is not because white wine is more susceptible to microbial growth, but instead it's to help keep the wine from going off color. In a red wine, changes in color might actually be desirable, but when a white wine turns brown, that is not considered to be a favorable characteristic, a positive characteristic. And so sulfur dioxide helps bleach wine pigments. And so by the addition, and I've drawn the structure for you here, you see where the sulfur attaches. And so when sulfur interacts with this anthocyanin in this way, it can completely bleach that molecule from red to clear solution. This is important not only for the preservation of wine, but it's worth mentioning to you as a method of getting rid of red wine stains. Hopefully, if you stain your white linen shirt with some red wine, you'll have a bottle of white wine on hand that you can pour a little bit of onto that stain, and because of the high concentration of sulfur dioxide there, you will be able to bleach that pigment away. There are a large number of anthocyanin variations. You see these R groups, and that's in organic chemistry terms. Those R groups are can be any number of other functional groups. That's going to, in addition to the pH issue, that's going to alter the color of that pigment as well. Again, there's the polymerization that alters the color of the wine. Now, let me mention what the process of winemaking is. It's very straightforward, as you imagine, for something that was invented in the Neolithic age. First of all, we take our ripe grapes and we crush them. Now, there's two processes that we can that are generally adhered to, and they lead to one, red wine, and on the other hand, white wine. White wine, when we crush the grapes, we immediately remove the skin and the seeds. Most of the pigment, if not all of the anthocyanin pigments, and much of the tannins are present in the seed and the skin. So if we remove the skin, we remove all of that exposure to that anthocyanin pigment, and so the wine itself is much less darkly pigmented. This liquid that we get from the crushed grapes is referred to as the must, and in either case, whether we remove the skins or leave the skins on for a number of days, up to a couple of weeks, in the case of red wine, we ferment. And in red wine, we ferment at relatively high temperatures, and that's, again, to extract those anthocyanins and tannins from the skins and the seeds that are present with the liquid. Whereas in white wine, we can ferment at a lower temperature and we ferment for a longer period of time, 4 to 6 weeks. At this point, the wine is referred to as new wine. And those of you that have spent much time in Italy, you can get lots of really wonderful new wine, probably in France too. I haven't been to France. However, there's a second fermentation stage that takes place, very interesting to us in terms of chemistry. Return of the leuconostic bacteria that we talked about originally in the production of sour creams of Northern Europe. And the leuconostic bacteria are carrying out something called malolactic fermentation. I'll leave this for a few minutes, another slide. This is the conversion, however, of bitter malic acid to milder lactic acid. So we introduce not one, but two anaerobes to carry out two different chemical processes to make the wine more palatable. After this second fermentation, there's the period where we rack and fine, and we can store the wine at different temperatures depending on whether we're red or. In either case, however, what we're doing here is removing solids. So the relatively low temperatures cause various molecules to precipitate out of solution, and when they settle down to the bottom, we remove the clear liquid from off of those, and so we're left with a clearer wine. There's an aging process. Not all wine is aged in barrels anymore, but typically we're talking about aging in barrels. For red wines, months to years. For white wines, a much briefer period. And this has everything to do with the development of interesting colors and the polymerization of those polyphenols that mellow the flavor of red wine, which are less important in a white wine because it has less of those molecules floating around in the first place. Finally, after that next aging period, there's a filter step, centrifugation. That's just a step where we use a centrifugal force. We spin the sample so that the heavy particles, solid particles, are forced to the bottom of the barrel or the tube, and we decant or pour off the clear liquid portion. And then into the bottle they go. And this we can age for more at this point, depending on what kind of wine we're talking about. We'll talk more about aging of wines next time. In any case, let me reiterate. The key step in determining whether we're going red or white has to do with when we remove the skins. Do we ferment and heat in the presence of skins to extract anthocyanins, or do we immediately remove them, thereby removing most of the pigment from the wine? After that, there's a fermentation period, and then there's a second fermentation period involving a new organism, and then it's basically removing solids and aging the wine. Okay, let me mention in this, our last slide of this lecture, the organism that's carrying out that malolactic fermentation. The Enococcus eni is a species of that Leuconostoc family, or genus rather, excuse me, and here's malic acid, maybe looking a lot to you like tartaric acid. I invite you to go back and see what the differences are. The bottom line is that malic acid is considered to be more tart or more astringent than lactic acid, and so we add an organism, Enococcus eni. Enologists are scientists that study wine. So there's our root word for wine. This organism converts that malic acid to what? Lactic acid and CO2. So another decarboxylation for you biochemists out there, right? We lose that carboxylic acid group. Here again is this reduction of NAD to NADH that's so common in these reactions. Something that's important to remember here is that we're generating carbon dioxide here. So can we carry out this fermentation in the bottle? No, unless we want to make a fizzy wine. It's important that this take place before we get to the bottle, even to the barrel, so that we can make sure that there's no excess CO2 dissolved in the wine that will come out as bubbles when we drink it. One other thing that I'll mention, and we'll come back to wine varieties next time, is this so-called noble rot. Here's this fungus species, Botrytis, that I mentioned last time, promotes the development of sotalon. And this is the only real reason I'm introducing this here is just we've seen sotalon as the byproduct of Maillard reactions and other Browning reactions. I mentioned that earlier in the first lecture. Here's the structure of that molecule. Kind of easy to see, perhaps, how this could be derived from a carbohydrate or sugar molecule. This fungus is actually beneficial to the production of the sauternes, late harvest sweet wine. So late harvest meaning perhaps there's more time for sugar to develop and become more concentrated, and that's going to lead to a sweeter wine. But part of that sweetness derives from the derivation of this compound from the grape's sugars, remembering that this compound provides that intense sweet aroma of caramelized sugar. This photograph just shows you what the grapes that have been infested with this fungus look like, and they're not pretty, but as with cheese, as with kimchi, as with many other products that we have and will encounter, uh, we consider in this case those microorganism infestations to be beneficial. So that's it for this week. Check back next week for more on wine varieties, brewing beer, and distilling spirits. Have a great weekend.